Ask yourself the question, if you grow up and growing up you see literally thousands of examples in cartoons, in movies, in books, and in real life of blacks being the victims of pain, the victims of aggression, and also the perpetuators, what seeds does that plant? What we try to do in the entire museum is to re-emphasize that the pieces in here are caricatures. They are not real people. It's a distortion. It's a lie.
I wish I was in the land of cotton, old times there, I'm not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland, in Dixieland where I was born in earth.
Many people who come to the Jim Crow Museum have little or no knowledge of Jim Crow. So we began the experience inside the museum with a display about Jim Crow, the character, and then we move into Jim Crow when it becomes a synonym for racial segregation. This wall here is a blown up version of an 1832 sheet music which was called Jim Crow. You have here the silhouette form of Thomas Rice, one of the early blackface performers in the U.S. who put blackface makeup on, got on stage and pretended to be a black character. He did not create blackface stage performances, but what he did do was to make the Jim Crow persona popular in the United States and across the world. This section of the museum actually has two of the ways we think of Jim Crow. One, Jim Crow as a blackface form of entertainment. Minstrel shows both shaped and reflected attitudes toward African Americans. Imagine if you were a white American, you didn't know a lot of African Americans, and the only depictions or portrayals of African Americans that you saw were from the minstrel stage. There you would find, dressed in blackface, white Americans pretending to be African Americans, and then later African Americans darkening their skins, pretending to be even darker African Americans, acting as buffoons and idiots and the like. Those shows became central to the creation, the legitimization, the spread of the ideas and beliefs that African Americans were inferior others.
When the man said, "Would you give me a situation, you'd have to put me through a simple self-examination."
No, stupid. You mean a civil service examination.
On the other side, what we have is Jim Crow as a synonym for segregation. And this showcase has objects that we would more traditionally associate with segregation. One of the lessons of the Jim Crow Museum is that Jim Crow segregation was so pervasive that it was omnipresent, that it was in every aspect of American society. Every major societal institution, the family, the government, the media, the military, higher education, all major institutions in our society bought into the idea that whites were superior to blacks in all ways that mattered. In every day, in every aspect of a society, the racial hierarchy was cemented and manifested. There is a sign here that says, "For colored patrons only." This shows the value of an object as a teaching tool. You've heard the story of Miss Rosa Parks and how she did not want to give up her seat. But what you might not know is that in many communities, blacks did ride in the front of the bus, at least all the way to the front except one seat from the white bus driver. But when white people got on the bus, they then had to move back. And what this sign demonstrates, if you notice the metal parts at the end, is that the sign was movable. And often it was the black person who had to not only get up to give their seat, but then had to themselves move the signage behind them. In that case, not only are you forced to move, you're forced to participate in your own victimization.
Nothing can
rider, but the blood-washed host, because this train is a clean train, this train.
The new Jim Crow Museum afforded us the opportunity to build this wall. For many Americans, when they think about what was Jim Crow, they think only of segregation laws. We know better than that. We know that Jim Crow included every aspect of society. However, the laws were an important part of Jim Crow. Laws that, for example, forbade African Americans and white Americans from playing checkers together, or being buried in the same cemetery, or fishing together, or doing anything that implied social equality. What we tried to do here was to put so many of those laws there that you really had a sense of how pervasive those laws were under Jim Crow. Some of those rules are codified into law. Some of them are norms that they're not laws, but they're just as real. So, for example, if you were in the Deep South or border states, you would have in constitutions and in local city ordinances laws that forbade certain behavior. But it is also the case that when you left the Jim Crow South and came north, that there were still practices. Sometimes they weren't codified into law, city ordinances, county ordinances. Sometimes they weren't laws in that sense. But trust me when I tell you that they limited interactions between African Americans and whites, that they limited opportunities for African Americans, and that a person, an African American, who violated those laws was punished.
It shall be unlawful for a white person to marry
the marriage of a person
segregation
of Caucasian blood,
any
Negro,
which
Mongolian,
shall be
Malay, or Hindu shall be no.
It shall be unlawful.
Jim Crow could not have existed without violence, real violence and the threat of violence. The reality is people would not put up with a caste system, being victimized within a caste system, if they did not fear violence. And it is an unfortunate truth that in the United States history, that thousands of African Americans were brutally murdered. I think the message to learn here is that violence was instrumental. By that I mean it was an instrument used to control African Americans, to control their ambition, to say to them, no, you will not have a white man's job, you will not date a white man's woman, you will not attend a white man's school, and if you try to do those things or anything that implies that you believe that you are an equal to a white man, you risk your life.
There is a fruit for the crows to pluck.
If I had my druthers, I would have scant, if any, space devoted to the Ku Klux Klan. The reason I've never liked to emphasize the Klan is because we don't want to associate racism with just an extremist group. The fact, though, is we've always had to have some Klan material because you cannot tell the story of America's race history or race relations in America's history without talking about the Klan.
Federal, don't catch me, catch that nigger behind that tree. Run, nigger, run, but a federal get you, run, nigger, run, you better get away.
As I said before, the Jim Crow could not have worked without violence. And that violence was real and potential. Here's a case where we have a real act of violence, but it's also reproduced, and so it becomes a threat of violence. What you see here is a postcard. So not only was the person beaten, but it became an image, a part of an object, an everyday object that would have been sent through the mail system. Blacks have been targets in games, in toys, and also in real life. Games like African Dodger, where a black person stuck their head through a hole, and we've tried to recreate that here, and people would throw balls at their faces. That brutality was replaced, some would say, by a less brutal form, meaning to use not real black people, but wooden blacks and plastic blacks and paper blacks. But of course, symbolically, the idea is still there. that blacks don't experience pain in the same way that whites do, that it's fun to throw at black people, that it is normative to punish them, and that the punishment of them can be public and can be fun for the punisher. Coon Chicken Inn was a chain of restaurants, mostly out west, Seattle, Portland, Salt Lake City. Inside the Coon Chicken Inn restaurants were every conceivable stereotype you can think of. So in the Jim Crow Museum, what we've done is to recreate the face of the Coon Chicken Inn porter as we enter the part of the museum that deals with caricatures. The idea is this: Jim Crow could not have existed without violence, and it could not have existed without millions, I mean literally millions of everyday caricatured objects which supported that system. We decided to use as much as possible a home motif for the museum. Here we have a kitchen, and in that kitchen we have Mammy. Mammy was one of the dominant caricatures of African American women. She was dark, she was a large woman, she was, at least by American standards, an unattractive woman. She had children, and yet she was often perceived as being desexualized. She was loyal to a fault. And that image of Mammy became this image that many white Americans associated with wholesomeness. So her face was placed on breakfast foods and other kitchen-related objects. And so what we did here is to put literally dozens of Mammy images in a kitchen. All racial and ethnic groups have been caricatured in this country. But the truth is, no group has been caricatured as much and in as many ways as have African Americans. Caricatures become rationalizations for the denial of opportunities. If, for example, you believe the caricature of African American men as coons, meaning lazy ne'er-do-wells, ignorant, people who are cultural parasites, if you perpetuate that caricature and accept that caricature, then that becomes a rationalization for denying African Americans the right to vote, to attend good schools. It becomes, indeed, a rationalization for supporting Jim Crow. Toys and games are an especially pernicious way to spread racist ideas. If you look at the depictions of African Americans in cartoons in the 1940s, what you'll notice is that they're actually caricatures. And as caricatures, they become techniques to use against African Americans who are pursuing what was then called social equality. The same thing is true with toys and games, except there's an added dimension there. In other words, in toys and games, African Americans are portrayed as coons and toms and sambos and pickaninnies, but they're often portrayed as victims, targets, as we saw before. Also, toys to be made to dance that the user can manipulate, that the user can abuse in some way, as some of the toys and games in the museum demonstrate. In the old museum, we did not have space to tell stories of how African Americans responded to racism, how they responded to the violence, how they responded to the caricatures. We are blessed in the new space to have some room to talk, for example, about how African American artists deconstruct racism, how they sort of use their art as a critique of racism. One of my favorite pieces is the piece No More by John Lockhart, because unlike the way Mammy was portrayed in movies and on some material objects, on his piece, he has a strong Mammy. She's not content with her position in life. She's not loyal. She is a woman who wants her rights. The new museum affords us the opportunity to tell the story of African Americans who achieved despite Jim Crow. The main idea is this, that even during the violence of Jim Crow and the suffocating, oppressive, almost omnipresent nature of Jim Crow, you had African Americans who were scholars, who were inventors, who were thinkers, who were civil rights leaders, politicians, people who served the country proudly in the military, and we think that that is a testimony of the resiliency not just of African American people, but of people in general. The one part of the museum that I wish was larger, and indeed if we do an expansion, this is one of the areas that will be expanded, and that is the area associated with civil rights. Think of the civil rights movement this way. The signing of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which we have one of the ink pens that President Johnson used to sign that landmark legislation into law, the signing of that bill represents the official death of Jim Crow. Now we know that the civil rights movement did not achieve all of its goals, and we know in some ways that it lasted beyond its period. But I like having a civil rights section of the museum because it was a direct assault on Jim Crow. Not just the laws, but also Jim Crow, the customs. You know, once a guy said to me, you can't legislate morality, you can't legislate behavior. And I thought about that. Yes, that's true in some ways, but the reality is this. When the segregation laws were taken down, it made it easier for people to change behavior. Not some of maybe the older people that had existed during the time, but certainly for the generations that followed. I think changing the laws did matter, and I think ultimately they made it easier to change behavior. When people go through the museum, they first see all the history of who was Jim Crow, what was Jim Crow, and then they see the role of violence and how violence served as an underpinning of Jim Crow. And then they see also the role that caricature objects played in both reflecting and shaping Jim Crow. And it leaves a really bad taste in your mouth. And then they get to the section on African American achievement. They get to the section on African American artists who use their art to deconstruct racism. And then they see the civil rights movement, which represented the death of Jim Crow. And then they feel good, and it's this feel-good story. But the story didn't end there. The reality is, even though America is more democratic and more egalitarian than it has ever been, race still matters in the U.S. All the images that you would have seen in the early part of the museum are still being produced. They are reproduced on modern objects like mouse pads. Sometimes they're reproduced to fool customers, so they're pretend antique, fake antiques. Some of them are just reproduced as cheap versions of the old objects because there is still a market for those ideas. The truth is this: the struggle against racism in general continues, and against racist imagery in particular continues. The Jim Crow Museum could probably outfit an entire section just on objects that defame President Obama. By defame, I don't just mean objects that disagree with his positions and policies. Certainly, any fair-minded, thoughtful thinking person can disagree with any politicians, including President Obama's policies. I'm speaking of objects that defame him racially, that portray him as a monkey, a savage, a cannibal, a Tom. In other words, objects that treat him the same way African Americans were portrayed during the Jim Crow period. If we do our work correctly, it means that a visitor to the museum doesn't hear us talk the entire time. Instead, we give them enough of the information about the museum, and then we create, in a deliberate, intentional way, a conversation among the people in the party. So, you look at an object and you are asked the question, what is it you see? What else is it you see? Why do you say that? Why do you believe what it is you're saying? And people listen. So one person looking at Aunt Jemima sees vestiges of slavery and segregation. Someone else sees, in a real way, a kind of nostalgic recreation of their childhood. The purpose is not to tell one that they're right and the other that they're wrong, although I have an opinion. The purpose is to have them engaged in dialogue. Again, we're at an institution. We believe in the triumph of dialogue, and we start with the visual thinking strategies of what is it you see. This mural is called the Cloud of Witnesses mural. It is one of the things that we simply had to have in the museum because it honors the lives of some of the people that were killed during the Civil Rights Movement. And if you notice, the names are written because we don't want people to forget their names. We don't want people to forget that they paid the ultimate price. This room then, with them as the backdrop, becomes a space where a small group of people, 10, 15, 20 people, can sit and can dialogue about what they just saw, what they just experienced in the Jim Crow Museum. But also, they can talk about what is it we as Americans need to be doing.
Says I done been to that long plank walk, and I'm on my way back home. Beauty calls me to weep, beauty calls me to moan, beauty calls me to be my home. I cried last night and the night before, and I swore not to cry no more. Beauty calls me to weep, beauty calls me to moan, beauty calls me to leave my home. I got no money and they call me no honey, I have to weep and moan. And 1899 he got killed on that streetcar line. They took him down that smoky road, brought him back on that two-lane road.